The year is 1299, and across the windswept hills of northwestern Anatolia, a dream begins to take shape. Not the kind of dream you have when you close your eyes at night, but the kind that reshapes the world for 7 centuries. Tonight, we're going to journey through the complete rise and fall of one of history's most powerful empires, the Ottoman Empire. From a small tribal confederation huddled around the town of Soot, to a vast dominion stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the Crimean steppes to the markets of Cairo. By the time we reach the end of this story, you'll understand how a single Turkoman chieftain's vision transformed into an empire that controlled 3 continents, revolutionized warfare, created architectural marvels that still take your breath away, and developed systems of governance so sophisticated they influenced the modern world. This is the tale of sultans and Janissaries, of magnificent palaces and brutal conquests, of tolerance and oppression, of incredible wealth and devastating decline. What you're about to hear isn't just the story of an empire, it's the story of how geography, religion, military innovation, and sheer human ambition can combine to create something that lasts for over 600 years. The Ottomans didn't just conquer territory. They created a new way of organizing human society across vast distances and diverse populations. They pioneered military technologies that changed warfare forever. They built cities that became the envy of Europe and created legal systems that balanced religious law with practical governance. But every empire has its seasons, and the Ottoman story contains within it the seeds of both its greatest triumphs and its ultimate dissolution. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let this epic unfold in your mind like the pages of history's most dramatic novel. Close your eyes and travel back to a time when the world was still being drawn on maps, when empires rose and fell based on the vision of individual leaders, and when a small band of warriors on the edge of the Byzantine Empire began a journey that would reshape 3 continents. The story begins with a man named Osman, but to understand Osman, we must first understand the world he inherited. The 13th century was a time of incredible upheaval across Anatolia. The great Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had dominated the region for over 2 centuries, was crumbling under pressure from Mongol invasions and internal decay. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome itself, had been weakened by centuries of warfare and was losing its grip on the territories it had held for 1,000 years. Into this power vacuum stepped dozens of small Turkoman principalities called beyliks. These were warrior bands led by chieftains who had originally come from Central Asia, bringing with them nomadic traditions of horsemanship, archery, and tribal loyalty. Each beylik controlled a small territory, raiding their neighbors, sometimes allying with the Byzantines against other Turkish groups, sometimes fighting against them. It was a chaotic patchwork of competing authorities, shifting alliances, and constant low-level warfare. Among these beyliks was one led by a man named Ertuğrul, who had established himself in the small town of Soyut, strategically positioned between the declining Seljuk territories and the Byzantine frontier. Ertuğrul served the Seljuk sultans when it suited him, but as their power waned, he began to act more independently. When he died around 1280, leadership of his small confederation passed to his son, a young man who would become known to history as Osman Gazi, Osman the Warrior. Osman was born into a world where survival depended on military skill, political cunning, and the ability to inspire loyalty among followers who could easily drift away to join more successful leaders. The young chieftain inherited perhaps a few hundred warriors and control over a territory that could be crossed on horseback in a single day. Yet within this modest inheritance lay the foundation of something extraordinary. What set Osman apart from the dozens of other Turkish chieftains of his era wasn't just his military ability, though he proved to be an exceptional warrior and tactician. It wasn't just his political skill, though he demonstrated remarkable talent for building alliances and managing diverse groups of followers. What made Osman different was his vision of what his small beylik could become, and his ability to create systems that would outlast his own lifetime. From his base in Suud, Osman began what would appear to be typical raiding activities against Byzantine territories. But these raids had a strategic purpose that went beyond simple plunder. Osman was systematically targeting the infrastructure that supported Byzantine control over northwestern Anatolia. He captured fortresses that controlled key mountain passes, seized towns that served as administrative centers, and gradually surrounded major Byzantine cities, cutting off their communication with Constantinople. The young leader's reputation began to spread throughout the Turkish communities of Anatolia. Warriors who had served other beyliks began to arrive at Suud, drawn by reports of Osman's military successes and his generous treatment of followers. More importantly, Osman began attracting not just warriors, but craftsmen, merchants, and scholars who saw opportunities in his expanding territory. This influx of diverse talents would prove crucial to transforming a raiding band into a functioning state. One of the most significant aspects of Osman's leadership was his approach to conquered populations. Rather than simply exploiting or driving out the Christians who lived in the territories he captured, Osman often incorporated them into his administrative system. He understood that managing an expanding territory required more than military force. It required people who understood local conditions, who could collect taxes, maintain records, and provide the administrative services that made civilization possible. This pragmatic approach to governance reflected a broader characteristic of early Ottoman leadership that would prove crucial to their later success. The Ottomans were remarkable synthesizers, taking useful elements from whatever sources they encountered and adapting them to their needs. From the Byzantines, they learned administrative techniques and architectural principles. From the Seljuks, they inherited traditions of Islamic governance and legal scholarship. From their nomadic ancestors, they retained military traditions and concepts of leadership that emphasized personal loyalty and merit-based advancement. Around 1299, Osman took a step that historians mark as the symbolic founding of the Ottoman Empire. He declared his independence from the declining Seljuk Sultanate and began having prayers said in his own name during Friday religious services. This seemingly simple act carried profound significance in Islamic political tradition. It marked Osman's claim to sovereign authority and his assumption of responsibility for the spiritual as well as temporal welfare of his subjects. The Declaration of Independence was more than symbolic posturing. It represented Osman's recognition that the old order was collapsing and that new institutions would be needed to replace it. He began establishing administrative systems that could function independently of Seljuk or Byzantine authority. He created a court that could resolve disputes according to Islamic law while respecting local customs. He organized tax collection systems that could fund his growing military forces while supporting the craftsmen and merchants who were creating wealth in his territories. Perhaps most importantly, Osman began developing the military innovations that would make his successors nearly invincible for the next 2 centuries. He recognized that the traditional nomadic tactics of his ancestors, while effective for raiding, were inadequate for siege warfare against heavily fortified Byzantine cities. He began recruiting specialists in siegecraft, incorporating new weapons and techniques, and developing the disciplined infantry formations that would eventually evolve into the famous Janissary Corps. The early Ottoman military was remarkably diverse and flexible. It included traditional Turkish cavalry, excellent at mobility and archery, but also infantry units trained in siege warfare, engineers capable of building and operating siege equipment, and naval specialists who could support operations along the coast. This military diversity reflected the broader Ottoman approach to empire building, which emphasized adaptation and inclusion rather than rigid adherence to traditional methods. As Osman's territory expanded, he faced the challenge that would confront every successful empire builder throughout history. How do you maintain the loyalty and effectiveness of your original followers while incorporating new populations and managing increasingly complex territories. Osman's solution involved creating what historians call a patrimonial system, where loyalty to the leader's person and family became the organizing principle of the state. Under this system, land and administrative positions were grants from the ruler rather than hereditary rights. This allowed Osman to reward successful followers while maintaining flexibility to reassign resources as circumstances changed. It also meant that administrative and military positions remained open to talent from any background, creating incentives for ambitious individuals to serve the Ottoman cause, regardless of their ethnic or religious origins. The patrimonial system had profound implications for Ottoman political development. It created a state that was highly centralized around the person of the ruler, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to local conditions across vast territories. It encouraged loyalty to the Ottoman dynasty while allowing for considerable diversity in local practices and customs. Most importantly, it created mechanisms for incorporating conquered populations that went far beyond simple military occupation. Osman's military campaigns during the first 2 decades of the 14th century established patterns that would characterize Ottoman expansion for centuries. Rather than attempting rapid conquest of large territories, the Ottomans typically engaged in gradual pressure campaigns that isolated target cities and regions, while building up their own administrative and military capabilities. They would surround a Byzantine stronghold, cut off its communications and supply lines, and then offer terms that allowed local leaders to maintain their positions in exchange for recognizing Ottoman authority. This approach had several advantages over purely military conquest. It reduced the costs and casualties associated with siege warfare. It preserved the economic infrastructure that made conquered territories valuable. Most importantly, it created opportunities for local leaders to become stakeholders in Ottoman success, rather than perpetual opponents of Ottoman rule. Many Byzantine nobles and administrators who submitted to Osman and his early successors became important figures in the emerging Ottoman state. The transformation of Osman's beylik into a genuine state apparatus accelerated during the final decade of his reign. By 1320, Ottoman territory included most of northwestern Anatolia, with a population that probably exceeded 100,000 people. The Ottomans controlled important trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, generating customs revenues that could support professional armies and administrative bureaucracies. They had established diplomatic relations with other regional powers, including the Byzantine Empire itself, which increasingly found it necessary to negotiate with rather than simply resist Ottoman expansion. Osman's capital at Soğut had evolved from a simple tribal encampment into a proper administrative center with permanent buildings, markets, mosques, and educational institutions. The town attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the Islamic world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that would become characteristic of Ottoman urban centers. This cultural diversity contributed to the intellectual and artistic achievements that would mark the Ottoman Golden Age centuries later. The legal system that emerged under Osman combined Islamic jurisprudence with practical administrative needs and local customs. Islamic law provided the fundamental framework for personal status, commercial transactions, and criminal justice. But Ottoman legal practice also incorporated Byzantine administrative traditions, Seljuk governmental procedures, and local customs that varied from region to region. This legal synthesis created a flexible system that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining overall coherence and legitimacy. As Osman aged, he faced the crucial challenge of ensuring succession that would preserve and extend his achievements. The Ottoman system that emerged during his final years established principles that would govern imperial succession for centuries, though not without considerable conflict and occasional civil war. Ottoman succession law favored the most capable male member of the ruling family rather than simple primogeniture, creating incentives for princes to develop military and administrative skills, while also creating potential for fraternal rivalry. Osman's son Orhan emerged as his designated successor during the 1310s, gradually taking over military command while his father focused on administrative and diplomatic affairs. This gradual transition allowed for continuity of leadership, while providing Orhan with the experience necessary to manage the increasingly complex Ottoman state. The partnership between father and son during Osman's final years established precedents for Ottoman governance that emphasized practical competence over theoretical authority. The death of Osman around 1326 marked the end of the founding era of Ottoman history, but the institutions and traditions he established continued to evolve under his successors. The small beylik that he had inherited from his father Ertuğrul had been transformed into a regional power with sophisticated military, administrative, and legal systems. More importantly, Osman had created a political culture that emphasized merit-based advancement, religious tolerance, and adaptive governance that would enable the Ottoman Empire to expand across 3 continents and endure for over 6 centuries. The legacy of Osman's leadership extended far beyond the territories he personally conquered or the institutions he directly established. He had created a model of empire building that balanced military effectiveness with administrative competence, religious legitimacy with practical flexibility, and central authority with local autonomy. These characteristics would enable his successors to achieve conquests and create institutions that would reshape the political, cultural, and economic landscape of Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries to come. Under Orhan's leadership, the small principality that Osman had forged began its transformation into something unprecedented in medieval history. When the young sultan inherited power in 1326, he faced challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser leaders. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, still commanded respect and resources that dwarfed those of any single Turkish beylik. The other Anatolian principalities viewed Ottoman expansion with suspicion and jealousy. Most daunting of all, Orhan had to prove that the systems his father had created could survive the transition of power and continue to evolve under new leadership. Orhan's first major test came with the siege of Bursa, a prosperous Byzantine city that controlled access to the fertile plains of northwestern Anatolia. The city had withstood Turkish attacks for decades, protected by massive walls and supplied through connections to the Byzantine naval base at the nearby coast. Traditional nomadic tactics had proven useless against such fortifications, but Orhan demonstrated that the Ottomans had learned to wage a different kind of warfare entirely. The siege of Bursa became a masterclass in the patient, systematic approach that would characterize Ottoman military operations for centuries. Rather than attempting direct assault against the city's formidable defenses, Orhan's forces gradually tightened their control over the surrounding countryside. They captured the smaller towns and villages that supplied Bursa with food and raw materials. They intercepted trade caravans and cut communication lines with other Byzantine territories. Most crucially, they established permanent siege camps that could be maintained for years if necessary, demonstrating a level of logistical sophistication that few medieval armies could match. The fall of Bursa in 1326 represented more than a military victory. It provided the Ottomans with their first major urban centre, complete with established markets, craft workshops, administrative buildings, and a diverse population that included Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, and Jewish financiers, alongside the Turkish Muslims, who had been arriving in increasing numbers. Orhan's decision to make Bursa his new capital, rather than simply looting it and returning to Soğut, revealed the strategic vision that would guide Ottoman expansion for generations. The transformation of Bursa under Ottoman rule demonstrated the empire's remarkable capacity for cultural synthesis and urban development. Rather than imposing a purely Turkish and Islamic character on the city, Orhan encouraged the continuation of commercial and craft activities that had made Bursa prosperous under Byzantine rule. Greek merchants continued to trade with Constantinople and the Italian city-states. Armenian craftsmen maintained their workshops and guilds. Jewish families found new opportunities in an empire that offered greater religious tolerance than they had experienced in many Christian territories. This inclusive approach to governance reflected sophisticated political calculation rather than simple benevolence. Orhan understood that the wealth and skills of conquered populations were essential resources that could not be replaced through military force alone. The administrative knowledge of Byzantine officials, the commercial networks of Greek merchants, and the technical skills of Armenian craftsmen were all crucial elements in building a state that could compete with established medieval powers. The years following the conquest of Bursa saw the emergence of distinctly Ottoman institutions that would define the empire for centuries. The most significant of these developments was the creation of the Devshirme system, a method of military recruitment that would eventually produce the legendary Janissary Corps. Under this system, Christian boys from conquered territories were periodically selected for service in the Ottoman military and administration. These recruits were converted to Islam, given extensive education and training, and integrated into the Ottoman elite as soldiers, administrators, and even grand viziers. The Devshirme system reflected the Ottoman genius for transforming potential weaknesses into sources of strength. Rather than viewing conquered Christian populations as permanent enemies or sources of instability, the Ottomans created mechanisms for incorporating the most talented individuals from these communities into the imperial elite. This approach served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided the empire with capable administrators and soldiers who had no competing family or regional loyalties. It created incentives for conquered populations to cooperate with Ottoman rule rather than resist it. Most importantly, it ensured that Ottoman institutions could draw upon the full range of human talent available within the empire's borders. The military innovations that emerged during Orhan's reign established patterns that would make Ottoman armies nearly invincible for the next 2 centuries. The core of Ottoman military strength remained the traditional Turkish cavalry, superb horsemen whose mobility and archery skills had terrorized enemies from Central Asia to the gates of Vienna. But Orhan supplemented these traditional forces with infantry units trained specifically for siege warfare, engineers capable of building and operating increasingly sophisticated siege equipment, and support personnel who could maintain supply lines across vast distances. The integration of firearms into Ottoman military doctrine began during this period, though it would reach full development only under later sultans. The Ottomans were among the first military powers to recognize the revolutionary potential of gunpowder weapons, not just for siege warfare, but for field battles as well. They recruited European specialists in cannon design and manufacturing, established workshops for producing firearms and ammunition, and developed tactical doctrines that maximized the effectiveness of these new weapons while maintaining the mobility and flexibility that had always characterized Turkish military operations. Perhaps even more significant than these technological innovations was the development of military institutions that could maintain professional standards across large, diverse armies operating in multiple theaters simultaneously. The Ottoman military system that emerged under Orhan created clear chains of command, standardized training procedures, regular pay systems, and disciplinary codes that apply to all soldiers regardless of their ethnic or regional origins. These institutional developments enabled the Ottomans to field armies that were not only larger than those of their enemies, but also more reliable, better coordinated, and capable of sustained operations far from their home territories. The expansion of Ottoman territory under Orhan followed strategic principles that would guide the empire's growth for centuries. Rather than pursuing conquest in all directions simultaneously, the Ottomans focused their efforts on objectives that would strengthen their overall position while weakening their most dangerous enemies. The capture of Nicaea in 1331 eliminated the last major Byzantine stronghold in northwestern Anatolia, while providing the Ottomans with another important urban centre. The seizure of Nicomedia in 1337 gave them control over the crucial land route between Constantinople and the interior of Anatolia. These conquests were not isolated military operations, but components of a comprehensive strategy designed to establish Ottoman dominance over the regions that would provide the foundation for future expansion. By controlling the key cities, trade routes, and agricultural areas of northwestern Anatolia, Orhan created a secure base of operations that could support much larger military enterprises. The wealth generated by controlling these territories funded the professional armies that would make possible the conquest of the Balkans and the eventual assault on Constantinople itself. The administrative systems that evolved during Orhan's reign established precedents that would influence Ottoman governance throughout the empire's history. The central principle of Ottoman administration was the balance between imperial authority and local autonomy. The Sultan and his appointed officials maintained control over military affairs, major judicial decisions, and fiscal policy. But local communities retained considerable freedom to manage their own internal affairs according to traditional customs and religious laws. This administrative flexibility proved crucial to Ottoman success in governing diverse populations across vast territories. Rather than attempting to impose uniform practices on all subjects, the Ottoman system accommodated different legal traditions, religious practices, and social customs, while maintaining overall imperial unity. Christians continued to be governed by their own religious authorities in matters of family law and community disputes. Jewish communities maintained their traditional forms of self-government. Even Muslim populations retained local customs that varied significantly from region to region. The emergence of a distinctly Ottoman legal system during this period reflected the broader synthesis that characterized the empire's approach to governance. Islamic law provided the fundamental framework for criminal justice, commercial regulation, and personal status issues. But Ottoman legal practice also incorporated elements from Byzantine civil law, local customary law, and administrative regulations developed specifically for imperial needs. This legal synthesis created a flexible system that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining overall coherence and legitimacy. The cultural and intellectual developments that began during Orhan's reign would eventually produce some of the greatest achievements in Islamic art, architecture, and scholarship. The Ottoman court became a center of learning that attracted scholars, poets, and artists from across the Islamic world and beyond. The imperial workshops established during this period would eventually produce the magnificent carpets, ceramics, and metalwork that made Ottoman decorative arts famous throughout Europe and Asia. The architectural innovations that emerged under Ottoman patronage combined elements from various traditions to create a distinctive imperial style that would influence building design across 3 continents. The great mosque complexes that began to appear in Ottoman cities during this period were not merely religious buildings, but comprehensive social institutions that included schools, hospitals, libraries, and facilities for travelers and the poor. These architectural complexes demonstrated the Ottoman commitment to creating institutions that served both spiritual and practical needs, while showcasing the wealth and sophistication of imperial power. As Orhan's reign progressed through the middle decades of the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire began to assume characteristics that would define its identity for centuries to come. The successful integration of diverse populations, the development of professional military and administrative institutions, and the creation of legal and cultural systems that could accommodate differences while maintaining unity, all contributed to the emergence of a new kind of political entity in medieval history. The transformation of the Ottoman Principality from a small frontier beylik into a regional power capable of challenging established empires required more than military conquest or administrative competence. It demanded the creation of new forms of political legitimacy that could appeal to diverse populations while maintaining the loyalty of the original Turkish warrior elite. Orhan's success in managing these complex challenges established foundations that would enable his successors to achieve conquests that would reshape the political geography of 3 continents. The death of Orhan in 1362 passed the throne to his son Murad, and with this succession came the moment when the Ottoman Empire would make its most fateful decision. For decades, the Ottomans had been content to expand within Anatolia, consolidating their control over Turkish territories and gradually absorbing Byzantine strongholds. But Murad possessed a vision that extended far beyond the familiar landscapes of his ancestors. Across the narrow straits of the Dardanelles lay Europe, a continent fragmented by political divisions, weakened by plague, and ripe for conquest by a power bold enough to seize the opportunity. The first Ottoman crossing into Europe in 1354 began almost accidentally. A devastating earthquake had damaged the fortifications of Gallipoli, the strategic fortress that controlled the European side of the Dardanelles. Murad's forces, originally sent to assist their Byzantine allies in a civil war, found themselves in possession of a foothold on European soil. Rather than withdrawing as their agreement required, the Ottomans recognized the unprecedented opportunity that fate had presented. They reinforced Gallipoli, established permanent garrisons, and began the systematic conquest of Thrace that would transform a regional Anatolian power into a truly transcontinental empire. The European territories that the Ottomans encountered presented challenges entirely different from those they had faced in Anatolia. The populations were predominantly Christian, speaking languages unrelated to Turkish, and following social customs that had developed over centuries of Byzantine and Balkan traditions. The terrain included vast plains ideal for cavalry operations, but also mountainous regions where local knowledge and guerrilla tactics could neutralize Ottoman military advantages. Most significantly, expansion into Europe brought the Ottomans into direct conflict with established powers that possessed resources and military capabilities, far exceeding anything they had previously encountered. Murad's response to these challenges demonstrated the adaptability that had become the hallmark of Ottoman leadership. Rather than attempting to govern European territories exactly as they had managed Anatolian provinces, the Ottomans developed new administrative approaches that could accommodate different religious traditions, legal systems, and social structures. The millet system that would eventually become one of the empire's most distinctive features began to take shape during this period, allowing Christian communities to maintain their own religious hierarchies and internal governance while acknowledging Ottoman political authority. The military campaigns that established Ottoman dominance in the Balkans revealed the full sophistication of the military machine that had been developing since Osman's time. The Battle of Maritsa in 1371 demonstrated Ottoman tactical superiority over traditional European heavy cavalry, as disciplined infantry formations supported by archers and early firearms devastated a coalition of Serbian and Bulgarian nobles. The victory eliminated organized resistance to Ottoman expansion in much of the southern Balkans, while establishing the Ottomans as the dominant military power in southeastern Europe. But Ottoman success in Europe depended on more than military superiority alone. The political fragmentation that characterized the Balkans in the 14th century provided opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering that often proved more effective than direct conquest. Local nobles faced with the choice between Ottoman domination and absorption by neighboring Christian powers frequently chose to accept Ottoman suzerainty while maintaining their traditional privileges and territorial control. This pragmatic accommodation created a network of vassal relationships that extended Ottoman influence far beyond the territories under direct imperial administration. The development of the Janissary Corps during Murad's reign transformed the Ottoman military into the most formidable fighting force in medieval Europe. These elite infantry units, recruited through the Devshirme system from Christian populations and trained from childhood in military discipline and Islamic theology, combined absolute loyalty to the Sultan with professional military competence that exceeded anything available to contemporary European armies. The Janissaries, were among the first military units in the world to master the effective use of firearms in coordinated formations, giving Ottoman forces decisive advantages in both siege warfare and open battle. The siege of Adrianople in 1369 showcased the full range of Ottoman military capabilities, while demonstrating their commitment to creating permanent institutions rather than simply conquering territory. The city's capture provided the Ottomans with a strategic base for further expansion into Europe. But more importantly, Murad's decision to make Adrianople his primary capital symbolized the empire's transformation from an Anatolian principality into a European power. The city, renamed Edirne, became the center of Ottoman administration for European territories and would remain the imperial capital until the conquest of Constantinople nearly a century later. The administrative innovations that emerged from governing European territories created precedents that would influence Ottoman policy throughout the empire's history. The challenge of managing populations that spoke different languages, followed different religious traditions, and maintained different legal customs required institutional flexibility that went far beyond anything the Ottomans had previously attempted. The solutions they developed emphasized accommodation rather than assimilation, creating systems that preserved local traditions while ensuring imperial loyalty and extracting the resources necessary for continued expansion. The establishment of the Timar system during this period provided the economic foundation that would support Ottoman expansion for centuries. Under this system, conquered lands were distributed to Ottoman officials and military commanders in exchange for providing specified numbers of armed horsemen for imperial campaigns. The Timar holders collected taxes and administered justice in their assigned territories, while maintaining cavalry forces that could be mobilized for military operations anywhere in the empire. This arrangement created a self-sustaining military system that could support large armies without placing impossible fiscal burdens on the central treasury. The cultural synthesis that began during the European expansion created new forms of artistic and intellectual expression that would eventually produce some of the greatest achievements in Islamic civilization. The Ottoman court attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the Islamic world, but it also began to incorporate influences from Byzantine, Slavic, and Western European traditions. The resulting cultural fusion created distinctly Ottoman forms of architecture, literature, music, and decorative arts that combined elements from multiple traditions while maintaining a coherent aesthetic identity. The religious policies that evolved during the conquest of the Balkans established patterns that would characterize Ottoman rule for centuries. While the empire remained fundamentally Islamic in its legal and administrative structures, the Ottomans demonstrated remarkable tolerance for religious diversity among their subjects. Christian communities were allowed to maintain their churches, follow their traditional religious practices, and govern their internal affairs according to their own customs. This tolerance was partly strategic, designed to minimize resistance to Ottoman rule, but it also reflected Islamic legal traditions that accorded protected status to Christian and Jewish populations. The transformation of conquered Christian populations through the Davshirmi system represented one of the most controversial but effective aspects of Ottoman imperial policy. The periodic recruitment of young Christian boys for military and administrative service created a class of officials who possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions while maintaining absolute loyalty to the Ottoman dynasty. Many of these recruits eventually rose to the highest positions in the imperial hierarchy, including the office of Grand Vizier itself. This system of recruitment ensured that Ottoman institutions could draw upon the full range of human talent available within the empire, while preventing the development of hereditary aristocracies that might challenge imperial authority. The economic transformation that accompanied Ottoman expansion into Europe created unprecedented opportunities for trade and commercial development. The empire's control over the land routes between Asia and Europe, combined with its dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean, enabled Ottoman merchants to participate in the lucrative spice trade and other forms of long-distance commerce. The wealth generated by these commercial activities provided the resources necessary to maintain the large armies and complex administrative systems that made continued expansion possible. The diplomatic relationships that the Ottomans established with European powers during this period revealed their sophisticated understanding of international politics and their ability to exploit divisions among their enemies. Rather than treating all Christian powers as natural enemies, the Ottomans frequently allied with one European state against another, using diplomacy to prevent the formation of coalitions that might effectively resist Ottoman expansion. These diplomatic maneuvers often proved as important as military victories in advancing Ottoman interests and establishing the empire as a legitimate participant in European political affairs. The legal innovations that emerged from governing diverse European populations created some of the most sophisticated jurisprudential systems in medieval history. Ottoman law successfully balanced Islamic religious requirements with practical administrative needs and local legal traditions. The resulting legal synthesis created courts that could handle commercial disputes involving merchants from different religious communities, resolve conflicts between Islamic and customary law, and maintain social order in territories where multiple legal systems operated simultaneously. The architectural achievements that began during the European expansion would eventually produce some of the most magnificent buildings in world history. The mosque complexes that the Ottomans constructed in their European territories were not merely religious buildings, but comprehensive social institutions that included schools, hospitals, public baths, and facilities for travelers and the poor. These architectural complexes demonstrated the Ottoman commitment to creating institutions that served both spiritual and practical needs, while showcasing the wealth and cultural sophistication of the empire. The military engineering innovations that supported Ottoman expansion included some of the most advanced siege warfare techniques of the medieval period. Ottoman engineers developed new methods for undermining fortifications, constructed sophisticated siege equipment that could breach the heaviest walls, and coordinated complex operations that combined traditional siegecraft with the emerging science of artillery warfare. These technical capabilities gave Ottoman forces decisive advantages over enemies who relied on static defensive strategies and traditional fortification methods. The intelligence networks that the Ottomans established throughout their expanding territories provided crucial information that supported both military operations and diplomatic negotiations. Ottoman spies and informants operated throughout Europe, providing detailed reports on political developments, military preparations, and economic conditions that enabled imperial planners to identify opportunities and anticipate threats. This intelligence capability often proved as valuable as military strength in determining the success or failure of Ottoman policies. The educational institutions that the Ottomans established in their European territories created new opportunities for intellectual development, while ensuring the training of administrators capable of governing diverse populations. The madrasas and other schools that were built throughout the Balkans provided instruction in Islamic theology and jurisprudence, while also teaching practical subjects necessary for commercial and administrative careers. These educational institutions created a class of educated officials who could serve as intermediaries between Ottoman imperial authority and local populations. As Murad's reign entered its final phase in the 1380s, the Ottoman Empire had been fundamentally transformed from its origins as a small Anatolian beylik. The empire now controlled territories spanning 2 continents, governed populations that included dozens of different ethnic and religious groups, and maintained military and administrative systems that could coordinate operations across thousands of miles. The foundations had been laid for the conquests that would make Murad's successors the most powerful rulers in Europe and the Middle East, while the institutional innovations that had emerged during this period of expansion would continue to evolve and adapt to new challenges for centuries to come. The death of Murad at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 marked the end of an era, but the systems and traditions he had established would enable his son Bayezid to inherit an empire capable of challenging the greatest powers of the medieval world. The small principality that Osman had founded less than a century earlier had become a transcontinental empire with the resources, institutions, and strategic position necessary to reshape the political geography of Europe, Asia, and Africa for the next 500 years. The ascension of Bayezid to the Ottoman throne in 1389 brought with it a new chapter in the empire's relentless expansion, though his reign would prove that even the mightiest empires face moments when ambition exceeds capability. Known to history as Bayezid the Thunderbolt for the lightning speed of his military campaigns, this sultan embodied both the greatest strengths and most dangerous weaknesses of Ottoman imperial culture. His story reveals how personal character and strategic vision could elevate an empire to unprecedented heights while simultaneously sowing the seeds of temporary but devastating collapse. The early years of Bayezid's reign demonstrated the full maturation of the military and administrative systems that his predecessors had spent decades perfecting. Within months of assuming power, the new sultan had consolidated Ottoman control over the remaining independent territories in Anatolia, absorbing the last of the Turkish beyliks that had once been the Ottomans' equals. This rapid expansion eastward provided the empire with additional resources and manpower, while eliminating potential rivals who might have allied with external enemies during moments of Ottoman weakness. The systematic nature of these Anatolian conquests revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the Ottoman military had developed over the previous century. Rather than conducting simple raids or isolated sieges, Bayezid's forces executed coordinated campaigns that involved multiple armies operating simultaneously across hundreds of miles of territory. Supply lines stretching from the Balkans to the Black Sea maintained these forces in the field for months at a time, while intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy movements and political developments that might affect Ottoman strategic planning. The integration of newly conquered Anatolian territories into the existing Ottoman administrative system proceeded with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating the institutional maturity that the empire had achieved by the end of the 14th century. Local populations found themselves incorporated into Ottoman tax systems, legal frameworks, and military recruitment programs with minimal disruption to their daily lives. The timer system expanded to encompass these new territories, creating additional cavalry forces while providing Ottoman officials with the resources necessary to maintain order and extract revenue for the imperial treasury. But Bayezid's ambitions extended far beyond the consolidation of Anatolian territories. The Sultan envisioned an empire that would dominate not just the land routes between Europe and Asia, but the entire eastern Mediterranean, challenging the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, while establishing Ottoman naval supremacy from the Black Sea to the shores of North Africa. This maritime strategy required the development of naval technologies and expertise that the traditionally land-based Ottomans had never before attempted to master. The construction of the first major Ottoman naval facilities during Bayezid's reign represented a fundamental shift in the empire's strategic orientation and military capabilities. Shipyards established along the Anatolian coast began producing vessels designed specifically for Mediterranean conditions, while Ottoman admirals recruited experienced sailors and navigators from Greek and Italian maritime communities. The emergence of Ottoman naval power created new possibilities for expansion, while also exposing the empire to maritime threats and diplomatic complications that land-based expansion had never entailed. The siege of Constantinople that Bayezid launched in the 1390s demonstrated both the remarkable capabilities that the Ottoman military had achieved and the limitations that still constrained their ambitions. For the first time in history, Ottoman forces possessed the technical means to breach the legendary walls that had protected the Byzantine capital for over 1,000 years. Massive siege cannons, some of the largest ever constructed, pounded the ancient fortifications, while Ottoman engineers dug tunnels beneath the walls and constructed elaborate siege works that gradually tightened the noose around the city. Yet despite these technological advantages and the overwhelming superiority of Ottoman forces, Constantinople remained unconquered. The city's position on a peninsula surrounded by water on three sides provided natural defences that even Ottoman military ingenuity could not entirely overcome. More crucially, the siege revealed the diplomatic costs of Ottoman expansion, as European powers that had previously remained neutral began to recognize the existential threat that Ottoman success posed to Christian Europe as a whole. The formation of the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396 represented the most serious military challenge that the Ottoman Empire had faced since its founding. A coalition of Hungarian, French, German, and other European forces assembled the largest Christian army seen in the Balkans for generations, determined to halt Ottoman expansion and drive the Turks back into Asia. The campaign attracted knights and nobles from across Europe, including some of the most famous military commanders of the age, all united by the conviction that Ottoman power had to be broken before it became unstoppable. The Battle of Nicopolis that autumn became one of the defining moments of medieval military history, demonstrating conclusively that the Ottoman military system had evolved beyond anything that traditional European warfare could challenge. The disciplined formations of Janissary infantry, supported by Turkish cavalry and coordinated artillery fire, systematically destroyed the flower of European chivalry in a single afternoon. The victory eliminated organized European resistance to Ottoman expansion for a generation, while establishing Bayezid's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders of his age. But the very completeness of the victory at Nicopolis may have contributed to the strategic overconfidence that would soon bring the Ottoman Empire to the brink of destruction. Bayezid began to believe that Ottoman military superiority was so overwhelming that traditional concepts of strategic caution and diplomatic prudence no longer applied. The Sultan launched simultaneous campaigns in multiple directions, stretching Ottoman resources and command capabilities beyond their limits, while creating new enemies faster than existing ones could be defeated. The resumption of the siege of Constantinople in the aftermath of Nicopolis demonstrated this dangerous overextension of Ottoman capabilities. While the imperial capital remained under siege, Bayezid simultaneously conducted military operations in Hungary, southern Italy, and eastern Anatolia, creating a strategic situation that required coordination and resource management beyond anything the empire had previously attempted. The administrative systems that had functioned effectively when managing expansion in a single direction began to show signs of strain when required to support operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. The emergence of a new threat from the east during the early years of the 15th century caught the Ottomans at their moment of maximum strategic overextension. Timur, known in European sources as Tamerlane, had built a Central Asian empire that rivaled the Mongol conquests of the previous century. His armies combined the traditional mobility and archery skills of steppe warfare with the latest developments in siegecraft and artillery, creating a military force that could challenge even the Ottomans on equal terms. The diplomatic maneuvering that preceded the Ottoman-Timurid conflict revealed the complex international situation that had emerged from decades of Ottoman expansion. European powers that had been fighting desperately against Ottoman encroachment suddenly found themselves hoping that the Eastern threat would eliminate their Western tormentor. Byzantine diplomats worked secretly to coordinate their resistance with Timurid strategy, while various Anatolian nobles who had been displaced by Ottoman expansion saw opportunities to recover their ancestral territories with Timurid support. The campaign that brought Bayezid's forces into direct conflict with Timur's armies in 1402 represented the collision of two of the most sophisticated military systems in the medieval world. Both sides possessed professional armies equipped with the latest military technologies and commanded by generals with decades of experience in coordinated operations across vast territories. The Battle of Ankara, that decided the campaign, demonstrated that Ottoman military supremacy was not absolute. as timid tactical innovations and strategic deception overcame the disciplined formations that had made Ottoman armies invincible against European opponents. The capture of Bayezid himself during the battle created a crisis that threatened the very survival of the Ottoman Empire. For the first time since Osman's death, the dynasty faced the possibility of extinction as competing claimants to the throne launched civil wars, while external enemies pressed their attacks against Ottoman territories. The administrative systems that had functioned smoothly under centralized imperial authority began to fragment as local officials found themselves forced to choose between rival claimants or simply act independently to preserve their own positions. The period of civil war and foreign invasion that followed Ankara became known as the Ottoman Interregnum, a decade of chaos that tested every institution and tradition that the empire had developed over the previous century. European forces recaptured territories that had been under Ottoman control for generations. While in Anatolia, the Turkish beyliks that Bayezid had absorbed began to reassert their independence with Timurid support. The survival of Ottoman power during this crisis would demonstrate the fundamental strength of the institutions that the first four sultans had created, while the eventual restoration of imperial unity would require innovations that would reshape the empire for centuries to come. The fragmentation of Ottoman authority during the interregnum revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the administrative systems that had evolved since Osman's time. In territories where Ottoman institutions had deep roots and local populations had developed genuine loyalty to the dynasty, provincial administrators and military commanders maintained order and continued to resist external threats even without central direction. But in regions where Ottoman control remained superficial, or where local populations retained strong attachments to pre-Ottoman traditions, the collapse of central authority led to immediate rebellion and the restoration of earlier political arrangements. The role of the Janissary Corps during the crisis demonstrated the complex loyalties that characterized the Ottoman military elite. As products of the Devshirme system, these soldiers had no family or regional ties that might conflict with imperial service, but the capture of their sultan and the fragmentation of central command created unprecedented situations that tested their institutional loyalty. Some Janissary units remained loyal to particular claimants to the throne, while others maintained their military organization while avoiding commitment to any faction until imperial unity could be restored. The diplomatic dimensions of the interregnum revealed how thoroughly the Ottoman Empire had become integrated into the international politics of Europe and the Middle East. European powers that had previously sought to contain Ottoman expansion now found themselves choosing between different Ottoman claimants based on calculations about which would be most amenable to their interests. Meanwhile, various Middle Eastern powers that had been threatened by Ottoman expansion began their own territorial acquisitions, creating new strategic complications that would influence Ottoman policy for generations. The gradual restoration of Ottoman unity under Mehmed I during the second decade of the 15th century required not just military victory over rival claimants, but the reconstruction of administrative systems that had been disrupted or destroyed during the years of civil war. Provincial governments had to be re-established, tax systems restored, and military units reconstituted from scattered remnants of the pre-interregnum forces. The process revealed the resilience of Ottoman institutions, while also highlighting areas where reforms would be necessary to prevent future crises. The lessons learned during the interregnum influenced Ottoman political development for centuries, creating new safeguards against succession crises, while also demonstrating the importance of maintaining strategic focus rather than pursuing expansion in multiple directions simultaneously. The empire that emerged from the crisis possessed greater institutional stability and more sophisticated diplomatic capabilities, but it had also learned the dangers of overextension and the importance of maintaining adequate reserves to meet unexpected challenges. The reconstruction period under Mehmed I and his successor Murad II established precedents for Ottoman recovery from major setbacks that would prove crucial during later periods of crisis. Rather than simply attempting to restore pre-crisis conditions, Ottoman leaders used the reconstruction process to implement reforms that addressed the underlying weaknesses that had contributed to the original disaster. These innovations in military organization, administrative procedure, and diplomatic strategy created a more resilient empire that could better withstand future challenges. The territorial losses that the Ottomans accepted during the restoration process reflected strategic calculations about the most defensible frontiers rather than simple weakness or lack of ambition. By concentrating their resources on core territories where Ottoman institutions had the strongest foundations, the restored empire created a more solid base for future expansion while avoiding the strategic overextension that had contributed to the original crisis. The emergence of new military technologies and tactical doctrines during the restoration period reflected Ottoman determination to maintain their competitive advantages while learning from their recent defeats. The integration of improved artillery systems, reformed cavalry tactics, and enhanced siege capabilities created military forces that were more effective than their pre-interregnum predecessors, while also being more sustainable and less dependent on the personal leadership of individual commanders. The diplomatic relationships that the restored Ottoman Empire established with its neighbors reflected a more sophisticated understanding of international politics and the importance of maintaining strategic flexibility. Rather than pursuing purely aggressive policies that united potential enemies against them, Ottoman diplomats began to exploit divisions among their neighbors while maintaining the option of peaceful coexistence when military solutions were not advantageous. The cultural and intellectual developments that emerged during the restoration period reflected the empire's growing confidence in its ability to synthesize influences from multiple traditions while maintaining its distinctive Islamic and Turkish identity. The architectural projects, literary works, and scholarly achievements of this era demonstrated that political recovery could be accompanied by cultural renaissance when properly supported by imperial patronage and institutional stability. As the Ottoman Empire entered the middle decades of the 15th century under the restored dynasty, it possessed military capabilities, administrative systems, and diplomatic experience that had been tested by the most severe crisis in its history and had emerged stronger than before. The stage was set for the conquest that would transform the Ottomans from a regional power into a world empire and establish their capital in the city that had been the dream of Muslim armies for 8 centuries. The fall of Constantinople awaited, and with it, the beginning of the Ottoman Golden Age that would reshape 3 continents and establish the empire as one of the great powers of the early modern world. The young man who would transform the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a world-spanning colossus was born in 1432, during the darkest years of the interregnum, when the very survival of his dynasty hung by the thinnest of threads. Mehmed, the 3rd son of Murad II, grew up hearing stories of his great-grandfather Bayezid's catastrophic defeat and witnessing the painstaking work of reconstruction that had restored Ottoman power. But where his elders saw cautionary tales about the dangers of overambition, young Mehmed saw opportunities that previous generations had been too timid to seize. From his earliest years, the prince demonstrated an intellectual curiosity and strategic vision that set him apart from the traditional Ottoman elite. While his contemporaries focused on mastering the conventional arts of warfare and administration, Mehmed immersed himself in the study of history, mathematics, engineering, and languages. He could converse fluently in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Italian, enabling him to communicate directly with scholars, diplomats, and technical experts from across the known world. This linguistic ability reflected a broader openness to learning from diverse sources that would prove crucial to his greatest achievements. The prince's fascination with military engineering began during his teenage years when he observed the siege operations that his father conducted against various European strongholds. Traditional Ottoman siegecraft had evolved considerably since the early raids of Osman's time, but Mehmed recognized that even greater innovations would be necessary to overcome the most formidable fortifications of the age. He began corresponding with European artillery experts, studying treatises on ballistics and metallurgy, and experimenting with new designs for siege weapons that could breach walls previously considered impregnable. When Mehmed ascended to the throne for the second time in 1451, following a brief earlier reign and his father's temporary abdication, he inherited an empire that had recovered from the disasters of the early 15th century, but remained constrained by the cautious policies that had enabled that recovery. The new sultan possessed grander ambitions than mere consolidation of existing territories. He envisioned an empire that would control the crucial waterways connecting Europe and Asia, dominate the trade routes that carried the wealth of the Orient to European markets, and establish itself as the legitimate heir to both the Roman and Islamic imperial traditions. The target of these ambitions was obvious to every observer of Ottoman policy. Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, remained a Christian enclave surrounded by Ottoman territory, its continued independence serving as both a strategic obstacle to Ottoman expansion and a symbolic affront to Muslim pride. Previous Ottoman sultans had besieged the city repeatedly without success, but Mehmed believed that new technologies and tactics could accomplish what traditional methods had failed to achieve. The preparations for the final siege of Constantinople revealed the remarkable technological and logistical capabilities that the Ottoman Empire had developed by the mid-15th century. Mehmed commissioned the construction of artillery pieces larger and more powerful than any previously seen in warfare. The most famous of these weapons, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, who had been rebuffed by the Byzantine court and welcomed by the Ottomans, could fire stone balls weighing over 1,200 pounds across distances that allowed bombardment from positions beyond the range of defensive countermeasures. The logistics required to transport, position, and operate these massive weapons demonstrated the sophisticated organizational capabilities that Ottoman administration had achieved. Teams of oxen and specialized transport equipment moved the great guns from the foundries where they were cast to the positions outside Constantinople's walls. Engineers constructed reinforced platforms capable of absorbing the tremendous recoil forces generated by firing such weapons, while artillerymen developed new techniques for loading, aiming, and maintaining these mechanical marvels under combat conditions. But technological superiority alone would not guarantee success against Constantinople's legendary defenses. The city's position on a triangular peninsula, protected by water on two sides and by massive land walls that had repelled attacks for over 1,000 years, required strategic innovations that went beyond simple artillery bombardment. Mehmed's solution involved coordinating land and sea operations with a sophistication that demonstrated how thoroughly Ottoman military thinking had evolved since the early days of simple cavalry raids and infantry assaults. The construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus during 1452 served multiple strategic purposes while showcasing Ottoman engineering capabilities. The fortress, known as Rumeli Hisara, controlled ship traffic through the strait and prevented Byzantine forces from receiving reinforcements or supplies from the Black Sea. More importantly, its construction served as a declaration of Ottoman intentions while providing a forward base for the siege operations that everyone knew were coming. The speed with which the fortress was completed astonished contemporary observers and demonstrated the mobilization capabilities that the Ottoman Empire could bring to bear when pursuing strategic objectives. Thousands of workers labored around the clock for months, guided by master masons and architects who created a structure that combined military functionality with architectural grandeur. The fortress represented more than a military installation. It was a statement of imperial power and technological capability that announced the arrival of a new era in Eastern Mediterranean politics. The naval innovations that accompanied Mehmed's preparations revealed another dimension of Ottoman adaptability and strategic thinking. Traditional Ottoman military strength had always been based on land forces, particularly the superb cavalry and disciplined infantry that had conquered the Balkans and Anatolia. But the geography of Constantinople required naval capabilities that could challenge Byzantine and Italian maritime expertise, developed over centuries of Mediterranean commerce and warfare. Ottoman shipyards along the Sea of Marmara began producing vessels designed specifically for the unique requirements of operations in the confined waters around Constantinople. These ships combined traditional Mediterranean design principles with innovations that reflected Ottoman strategic needs and manufacturing capabilities. The resulting fleet possessed sufficient firepower to engage enemy warships, while also serving as platforms for landing operations and supply missions that would be crucial to maintaining siege operations over extended periods. The diplomatic preparations for the siege demonstrated Mehmed's sophisticated understanding of international politics and his ability to exploit divisions among potential enemies. Rather than simply launching military operations and hoping for the best, the Sultan conducted careful negotiations designed to neutralize possible intervention by European powers, while securing the cooperation or at least neutrality of neighbors who might otherwise complicate his strategic planning. The recruitment of technical specialists from across Europe revealed the cosmopolitan character that Ottoman imperial culture had developed by the 15th century. Artillery experts, military engineers, naval architects, and siege specialists found lucrative employment in Ottoman service, bringing with them knowledge and skills that had been developed in the workshops and universities of Christian Europe. This brain drain from European courts to the Ottoman capital reflected both the empire's growing wealth and its leaders' recognition that military success required the best available expertise, regardless of its origins. The final siege of Constantinople began in April 1453 with a systematic bombardment that demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of the new Ottoman artillery. Day after day, the massive siege guns pounded sections of the ancient walls, gradually creating breaches that traditional masonry could not repair quickly enough to prevent. The psychological impact of this relentless bombardment proved as important as its physical effects, as defenders who had grown up believing in the invincibility of their fortifications watched centuries-old stones crumble under the impact of Ottoman engineering. The coordination of multiple simultaneous attacks revealed the operational sophistication that Ottoman military organization had achieved under Mehmed's leadership. While artillery continued its methodical destruction of the land walls, Ottoman naval forces attempted to force their way into the Golden Horn, the protected harbour that provided Constantinople with secure access to the sea. Infantry assaults probed for weaknesses in the defensive perimeter, while engineers worked to undermine wall sections through tunnelling operations that reflected techniques learned from European siege warfare. The famous transportation of Ottoman ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn demonstrated the innovative thinking that characterized Mehmed's approach to seemingly impossible problems. When Byzantine forces succeeded in blocking the harbour mouth with a heavy chain, preventing direct naval assault, Ottoman engineers devised a scheme to drag warships across the hills, separating the two bodies of water. This audacious operation required precise engineering calculations, massive logistical coordination, and flawless execution under combat conditions. The success of the overland ship movement shocked defenders and observers throughout Europe, while demonstrating capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of medieval military operations. The sight of fully rigged warships sailing across dry land challenged assumptions about what was possible in siege warfare, while providing Ottoman forces with naval access to previously secure areas of the city's defences. The psychological impact of this achievement may have been even greater than its immediate tactical value, as it demonstrated that Ottoman ingenuity could overcome any obstacle that geography or human engineering could devise. The final assault on Constantinople in May 1453 culminated months of preparation and coordination that had tested every aspect of Ottoman military and administrative capability. The attack began before dawn with coordinated assaults against multiple sections of the defensive perimeter, preventing Byzantine forces from concentrating their limited manpower at any single threatened point. Artillery fire reached crescendo intensity as the great guns focused on creating practical breaches in the walls, while smaller weapons provided covering fire for advancing infantry formations. The breakthrough that decided the siege's outcome demonstrated both the effectiveness of Ottoman tactical coordination and the courage of individual soldiers who risked everything for imperial glory and personal advancement. Janissary units, advancing through breaches in the walls, encountered fierce resistance from Byzantine defenders who knew they were fighting for their city's survival and their civilization's continuation. The hand-to-hand combat that raged through the breach points tested the discipline and training that had made Ottoman infantry the most feared foot soldiers in Europe. The death of Constantine XIII, the last Byzantine emperor, during the final assault symbolized the end of an imperial tradition that had endured for over 1,000 years, while marking the beginning of Ottoman control over one of the world's most strategically important cities. The emperor's decision to die, fighting alongside his soldiers rather than fleeing or surrendering, reflected the desperate courage of defenders who understood the historical significance of their struggle. His death eliminated any possibility of continued Byzantine resistance, while providing the Ottomans with undisputed control over their new conquest. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul under Ottoman rule demonstrated the empire's remarkable capacity for urban administration and cultural synthesis. Rather than simply looting the conquered city and leaving it to decay, Mehmed immediately began implementing policies designed to restore its prosperity, while adapting its infrastructure to serve Ottoman administrative and commercial needs. The Sultan's declaration that the city would become his new capital announced his intention to create an imperial center worthy of his expanded dominions. The repopulation policies that Mehmed implemented revealed both the pragmatic and visionary aspects of Ottoman imperial planning. Understanding that a great city required a diverse population with varied skills and economic activities, the Sultan actively recruited merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and other specialists from throughout his empire and beyond. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Italians, and other groups found opportunities in the new Ottoman capital while contributing their expertise to the city's economic and cultural revival. The architectural projects that began immediately after the conquest demonstrated Mehmed's determination to create a capital that would rival the greatest cities of Europe and Asia. The construction of new mosques, palaces, markets, and public buildings employed the finest architects and craftsmen available while incorporating design elements that reflected the empire's diverse cultural influences. The Topkapi Palace, begun during Mehmed's reign and expanded by his successors, became one of the architectural marvels of the age while serving as the administrative center of a transcontinental empire. The establishment of new educational institutions reflected the Sultan's recognition that governing a world empire required administrators, judges, and specialists with sophisticated training in law, theology, mathematics, and other essential subjects. The madrasas and other schools that were founded in the new capital attracted students from across the Islamic world while developing curricula that combined traditional Islamic learning with practical subjects necessary for imperial administration. The commercial policies that Mehmed implemented transformed Istanbul into one of the great trading centers of the early modern world. The city's position at the junction of Europe and Asia made it a natural focus for international commerce, but Ottoman policies that encouraged trade while maintaining security and providing legal protections for merchants from all backgrounds created unprecedented opportunities for commercial development. The wealth generated by this commercial activity provided the resources necessary to support the military forces and administrative systems that would enable continued Ottoman expansion. The conquest of Constantinople established Mehmed's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history, while transforming the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into a world empire. The strategic significance of controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits gave the Ottomans the ability to regulate trade between Europe and Asia, while providing secure communications between their European and Anatolian territories. More importantly, the psychological impact of conquering the city that had resisted Muslim armies for 8 centuries established Ottoman prestige throughout the Islamic world, while shocking Christian Europe into recognition that a new great power had emerged. The administrative innovations that emerged from governing the expanded empire reflected the sophistication that Ottoman institutions had achieved by the mid-15th century. The integration of new territories and populations required administrative flexibility while maintaining the centralized control that had enabled previous Ottoman successes. The solutions that were developed balanced imperial authority with local autonomy in ways that would influence Ottoman governance for centuries, while providing models for other empires facing similar challenges. The military reforms that followed the conquest incorporated lessons learned during the siege while preparing Ottoman forces for the even greater challenges that lay ahead. The successful integration of artillery into Ottoman tactical doctrine required new training methods, supply systems, and organizational structures that could support the complex logistics of early modern warfare. The resulting military system combined traditional Ottoman strengths in cavalry and infantry with technological innovations that gave them decisive advantages over contemporary opponents. The cultural and intellectual developments that flourished in the new Ottoman capital reflected the empire's growing confidence in its ability to synthesize influences from multiple traditions while maintaining its distinctive Islamic identity. The libraries, observatories, and workshops that were established attracted scholars and artists from across the known world, while fostering innovations that contributed to the broader development of human knowledge and artistic expression. As Mehmed's reign entered its final decades, the Ottoman Empire had been fundamentally transformed from its origins as a small Anatolian principality. The conquest of Constantinople had provided not just a magnificent capital, but also the strategic position and symbolic authority necessary to support expansion that would eventually encompass territories from Hungary to Yemen, from the Crimea to Algeria. The institutions and traditions that had been tested and refined during the empire's first century and a half of existence were now ready to support the creation of one of the largest and most durable empires in human history. The death of Mehmed the Conqueror in 1481 marked the end of an era, but the systems and precedents he had established would enable his successors to achieve conquests and create institutions that would influence the development of 3 continents for centuries to come. The small beylik that Osman had founded less than 2 centuries earlier had become a world empire with the resources, capabilities, and strategic vision necessary to challenge any power on earth. The stage was set for the golden age that would make the Ottoman Empire one of the defining forces of the early modern world. The throne that passed to Bayezid II in 1481 carried with it the weight of unprecedented expectations. His father had achieved what 8 centuries of Muslim rulers had only dreamed of, and now the son faced the challenge of proving himself worthy of such a legacy. But Bayezid possessed a temperament entirely different from the bold, calculating conqueror who had preceded him. Where Mehmed had been driven by visions of empire and glory, Bayezid was a contemplative ruler who preferred consolidation to conquest, scholarship to warfare, and peaceful administration to the endless campaigns that had defined Ottoman leadership for nearly 2 centuries. This shift in imperial temperament created both opportunities and challenges that would profoundly influence the empire's development. On one hand, Bayezid's cautious approach allowed the Ottomans to digest the enormous territorial gains of the previous century, establishing stable administrative systems in newly conquered territories, while building the economic foundations that would support future expansion. The empire's population had grown dramatically as conquered peoples were integrated into Ottoman society. Cities flourished under the security that imperial unity provided, and trade routes connecting 3 continents generated unprecedented wealth for the imperial treasury. The architectural achievements of Bayezid's reign reflected this period of consolidation and cultural development. The Sultan commissioned magnificent mosque complexes, bridges, and public buildings that demonstrated the empire's growing wealth while providing practical benefits for urban populations. The Bayezid Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1506, represented the mature Ottoman architectural style that combined Byzantine grandeur with Islamic spiritual principles and Turkish engineering innovations. These construction projects employed thousands of craftsmen while creating urban landmarks that reinforced Ottoman cultural identity and imperial prestige. But the Sultan's preference for peaceful development over military expansion created frustrations among the traditional Ottoman military elite who had grown accustomed to the opportunities for advancement and enrichment that constant warfare provided. The Janissary Corps, in particular, began to exhibit signs of restlessness as their role shifted from active combat to garrison duty and ceremonial functions. The Devshirme system continued to recruit young men for military service, but without regular campaigns to test their skills and provide advancement opportunities, these elite soldiers began to involve themselves in political affairs and commercial activities that would eventually challenge imperial authority. The emergence of new threats along the empire's expanding frontiers demanded military responses that tested Bayezid's preference for peaceful solutions. In the east, the rising Safavid dynasty in Persia posed both territorial and ideological challenges to Ottoman authority. The Safavids' promotion of Shia Islam created religious tensions within the Ottoman Empire's diverse Muslim population, while their territorial ambitions in Mesopotamia and the Caucasus conflicted directly with Ottoman strategic interests. These eastern pressures would eventually force even the Pacific Bayezid to authorize military campaigns that stretched Ottoman resources and diplomatic capabilities. The naval challenges that emerged in the Mediterranean during this period revealed another dimension of the empire's growing responsibilities and vulnerabilities. Spanish expansion into North Africa, Portuguese activities in the Indian Ocean, and the continuing maritime power of Venice and Genoa all threatened Ottoman commercial interests and strategic positions. The development of Ottoman naval capabilities required massive investments in shipbuilding, naval bases, and the training of sailors and officers who could match the expertise of established maritime powers. The integration of new naval technologies and tactics into Ottoman military doctrine proved as challenging as the earlier adoption of artillery and firearms. Traditional Ottoman military strength had always been based on land forces, and the empire's leaders had to learn entirely new forms of warfare that operated according to different principles and required different types of expertise. The recruitment of experienced sailors from Greek and Italian communities within the empire provided essential knowledge, but building a truly effective Ottoman navy required years of experimentation and considerable financial investment. The administrative challenges of governing an empire that now spanned 3 continents tested every aspect of Ottoman institutional capacity. Communication across such vast distances required sophisticated courier systems and relay stations that could maintain contact between the capital and distant provinces. Tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration all had to be coordinated across territories that included dozens of different ethnic groups, religious communities, and local legal traditions. The millet system that had evolved during earlier periods of Ottoman expansion reached full maturity under Bayezid's administration. This remarkable arrangement allowed religious communities throughout the empire to maintain their own legal systems, educational institutions, and community leadership while acknowledging Ottoman political authority and fulfilling their fiscal obligations to the imperial treasury. The system's success depended on careful balancing of imperial needs with local autonomy, requiring constant negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed. The economic prosperity that characterized much of Bayezid's reign reflected the empire's successful integration of diverse commercial networks and production systems. Ottoman control over crucial trade routes enabled merchants from throughout the empire to participate in lucrative long-distance commerce, while imperial policies that protected property rights and enforced commercial contracts created stable conditions for business development. The wealth generated by this commercial activity supported not only military forces and administrative systems, but also the cultural and intellectual achievements that marked this period as one of Ottoman history's golden ages. The educational institutions that flourished during this period created new opportunities for intellectual development while training the administrators, judges, and specialists necessary for governing such a complex empire. The madrasas established in major cities throughout Ottoman territories provided instruction in Islamic law, theology, literature, and the practical subjects necessary for governmental service. These schools attracted students from across the Islamic world while developing distinctly Ottoman approaches to education that balanced religious instruction with practical training. The scholarly achievements of this period reflected the empire's growing confidence in its cultural mission and intellectual capabilities. Ottoman historians began producing comprehensive chronicles that recorded the empire's achievements while placing them within broader contexts of Islamic and world history. Poets developed new literary forms that incorporated influences from Persian, Arabic, and Turkish traditions, while expressing distinctly Ottoman themes and sensibilities. Legal scholars created sophisticated jurisprudential systems that balanced Islamic religious requirements with the practical needs of governing diverse populations across vast territories. The diplomatic relationships that the Ottoman Empire established during Bayezid's reign revealed the empire's emergence as a major player in international politics. European powers that had previously dismissed the Ottomans as merely another barbarian threat now recognized the need for formal diplomatic relations with what had become one of the world's most powerful states. The exchange of ambassadors, the negotiation of commercial agreements, and the conclusion of military alliances all demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire had achieved recognition as a legitimate participant in the international system. The challenge of succession that emerged during Bayezid's later years revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Ottoman political institutions. The Sultan's sons, particularly Selim and Ahmed, represented different approaches to imperial leadership and attracted support from different factions within the Ottoman elite. Selim advocated for aggressive expansion and military campaigns that would restore the empire's warrior traditions, while Ahmed favoured continuation of his father's peaceful policies and administrative consolidation. The civil conflict that erupted between these competing visions of Ottoman leadership tested the empire's institutional stability while revealing the continuing importance of military support for political authority. The Janissary Corps and other military units ultimately determined the succession by supporting Selim's aggressive approach over Ahmed's peaceful alternative. This military intervention in political succession established precedents that would influence Ottoman politics for centuries, while demonstrating the continuing centrality of warfare to imperial identity. The accession of Selim I to the throne in 1512 marked a dramatic shift in Ottoman policy and strategic orientation. Where his father had focused on consolidation and peaceful development, Selim possessed ambitions for expansion that rivaled those of Mehmed the Conqueror himself. But the new sultan's targets lay not in Europe, where Ottoman expansion had been concentrated for over a century, but in the east and south, where the Safavid and Mamluk empires controlled territories that Selim viewed as rightfully belonging to the Ottoman realm. The eastern campaigns that Selim launched immediately after securing his throne demonstrated both the military capabilities that the Ottoman Empire had developed during decades of relative peace and the strategic vision that would transform the empire from a primarily European power into a truly global force. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 showcased Ottoman artillery superiority over traditional cavalry forces while establishing Ottoman dominance over eastern Anatolia and northwestern Persia. More importantly, the victory eliminated the Safavid threat to Ottoman security while opening routes for further expansion toward the Indian Ocean and Central Asia. The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate between 1516 and 1517 represented perhaps the most significant strategic achievement in Ottoman history after the fall of Constantinople. The absorption of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt brought the Ottoman Empire control over some of the wealthiest and most strategically important territories in the Islamic world. The acquisition of the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina provided the Ottoman sultans with religious authority that complemented their political and military power, establishing them as the legitimate leaders of the Islamic world. The integration of these vast new territories required administrative innovations that went beyond anything the Ottomans had previously attempted. The Mamluk lands possessed their own governmental traditions, legal systems, and military organizations that had functioned effectively for centuries. Rather than simply imposing Ottoman institutions on these territories, Selim's administrators developed hybrid systems that preserved local expertise while ensuring imperial control and revenue extraction. The naval implications of controlling the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea coastlines transformed Ottoman strategic capabilities while creating new responsibilities and vulnerabilities. The empire now possessed naval bases from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean, enabling projection of power across maritime regions that had previously been beyond Ottoman reach. But these expanded maritime responsibilities also exposed the empire to challenges from Portuguese and other European naval powers that were establishing their own positions in the Indian Ocean trading system. The wealth that flowed into the Ottoman treasury from these new conquests provided resources for military innovations and administrative expansion that would support even greater achievements under Selim's successor. The gold and silver that arrived from Egyptian mines and Sudanese tributaries, combined with customs revenues from trade routes that now lay entirely within Ottoman territory, created unprecedented opportunities for imperial investment in military technology, urban development, and cultural patronage. The cultural and intellectual impact of incorporating Arabic-speaking territories into the Ottoman Empire enriched the empire's scholarly and artistic traditions while connecting Ottoman institutions more directly to classical Islamic civilization. The libraries, mosques, and educational institutions of Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem brought Ottoman scholars into contact with manuscripts and intellectual traditions that had been preserved and developed over centuries of Islamic learning. This cultural synthesis would contribute to the remarkable achievements of the Ottoman Golden Age that was about to begin. The military reforms that Selim implemented to support his expanded strategic commitments revealed the Ottoman Empire's remarkable capacity for institutional adaptation and innovation. The integration of new artillery systems, the expansion of the Janissary Corps, and the development of specialized units for different types of terrain and warfare all reflected systematic approaches to military modernization that kept Ottoman forces ahead of their competitors in technological capability and tactical sophistication. The diplomatic challenges created by Ottoman expansion into traditional Arab territories required new approaches to international relations that balanced imperial ambitions with practical limitations on Ottoman power projection capabilities. The empire now shared borders with Portuguese territories in the Indian Ocean, maintained complex relationships with various Arabian tribal confederations, and faced potential conflicts with other Islamic powers that possessed legitimate claims to territories that the Ottomans had absorbed. The death of Selim Themaumes in 1520 passed to his son Suleiman an empire that had been fundamentally transformed during 8 years of aggressive expansion. The territories that Selim had conquered roughly doubled the empire's size while providing control over trade routes, religious sites, and strategic positions that established the Ottomans as one of the world's dominant powers. The administrative systems, military capabilities, and diplomatic relationships that had been developed to govern these vast new territories created foundations that would support the greatest achievements in Ottoman history. The young sultan who inherited this transformed empire possessed both the vision and the capabilities necessary to build upon his father's conquests, while creating institutions and cultural achievements that would make his reign the defining era of Ottoman civilization. Suleiman's combination of military genius, administrative skill, legal scholarship, and cultural patronage would produce an empire that stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the borders of Persia, while creating legal codes, architectural marvels, and intellectual achievements that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The stage was set for the Ottoman Golden Age, when the empire that had begun as a small frontier principality would reach the zenith of its power and influence, creating institutions and cultural achievements that would establish it as one of history's greatest civilizations, while demonstrating the remarkable potential of human organization, ambition, and creative synthesis across the boundaries of religion, ethnicity, and geography. The young prince who would earn the title Magnificent from European courts and lawgiver from his own subjects ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520 at the age of 26, inheriting an empire whose borders stretched across 3 continents, but whose greatest achievements still lay ahead. Suleiman possessed that rare combination of intellectual brilliance and practical wisdom that appears perhaps once in a generation among rulers, a mind capable of grasping both the grand strategic vision necessary for world conquest and the minute administrative details required to govern diverse populations across vast distances. From his earliest days as sultan, Suleiman demonstrated an understanding of power that transcended mere military might. While his predecessors had built the Ottoman Empire through conquest and administrative innovation, Suleiman recognized that true imperial greatness required the creation of institutions and cultural achievements that would outlast any individual ruler's lifetime. His approach to governance balanced the aggressive expansion that Ottoman military tradition demanded with the careful consolidation and legal codification that permanent imperial authority required. The military campaigns that opened Suleiman's reign revealed the full maturation of Ottoman military capabilities that had been developing for over 2 centuries. The Siege of Belgrade in 1521 demonstrated how thoroughly Ottoman forces had mastered the integration of traditional cavalry tactics with modern artillery and infantry formations. The fortress that had resisted Hungarian and other European forces for generations fell to Ottoman assault in a matter of weeks, opening the path for expansion deep into Central Europe, while establishing Suleiman's reputation as a commander capable of achieving what his predecessors had only attempted. The conquest of Rhodes in 1522 showcased another dimension of Ottoman military evolution, as the empire's naval capabilities reached levels that could challenge the most established maritime powers in the Mediterranean. The Knights of St. John, who had held this strategic island for over 2 centuries, possessed some of the most advanced fortifications and naval expertise in Europe. Their defeat by Ottoman forces required coordination of land and sea operations that demonstrated the empire's ability to project power across water barriers while maintaining complex siege operations far from their primary bases. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these early victories was not their immediate military impact, but their demonstration of Suleiman's approach to governance of conquered territories. Rather than simply occupying captured strongholds and extracting tribute, the Sultan implemented policies designed to integrate new populations into Ottoman society while preserving local institutions that could contribute to imperial strength. The Christian inhabitants of Belgrade found themselves protected under Ottoman law, while the defeated Knights of Rhodes were allowed to depart with honor rather than facing execution or enslavement. The Hungarian campaign that culminated in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 represented the pinnacle of Ottoman military achievement in Europe, while revealing the strategic limitations that would eventually constrain the empire's expansion. The destruction of Hungarian royal power in a single afternoon demonstrated the overwhelming superiority that Ottoman military organization had achieved over traditional European feudal armies. King Louis II of Hungary perished along with much of his nobility, eliminating organized resistance to Ottoman expansion throughout the Danube Valley. Yet the very completeness of the victory at Mohacs created strategic challenges that would test Ottoman institutional capabilities for decades to come. The sudden collapse of Hungarian resistance left the Ottomans responsible for governing territories populated by peoples who had no experience with Islamic law or Ottoman administrative practices. The integration of these lands required administrative innovations that balanced imperial authority with local traditions while preventing the emergence of resistance movements that could threaten Ottoman control. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 marked both the high point of Ottoman expansion in Europe and the beginning of recognition that even Ottoman military superiority had geographical and logistical limits. The city's position, deep within European territory, protected by the Habsburg monarchy's resources and supported by a coalition of Christian powers, required supply lines and coordination capabilities that pushed Ottoman logistics beyond their sustainable limits. While the siege demonstrated Ottoman ability to project power to the very heart of Europe, its ultimate failure revealed that imperial expansion had practical boundaries, even for the most successful military system of the age. The administrative revolution that Suleiman implemented during his reign created legal and governmental institutions that would influence not only Ottoman territories, but legal development throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The Sultan's systematic codification of Ottoman law produced the most comprehensive legal system that any medieval or early modern empire had achieved, balancing Islamic religious requirements with practical administrative needs and local customs in ways that had never before been attempted on such a scale. The legal code that emerged from this effort, known as the Kanunami, addressed every aspect of imperial governance from criminal justice and commercial regulation to tax collection and military organization. But perhaps its most remarkable characteristic was its explicit recognition of equality before the law, regardless of social status, religious affiliation, or ethnic origin. This principle, revolutionary for its time, established legal protections for all Ottoman subjects while creating mechanisms for resolving disputes that could accommodate the empire's extraordinary diversity. The implementation of these legal reforms required the training of thousands of judges, administrators, and legal specialists who could apply Ottoman law consistently across territories that encompassed dozens of different legal traditions and local customs. The educational institutions that Suleiman established for this purpose created the most sophisticated system of professional legal education that the medieval world had seen, producing graduates who possess both theoretical knowledge of jurisprudence and practical experience in applying legal principles to complex real-world situations. The architectural achievements that flourished under Suleiman's patronage reflected the empire's cultural confidence and its ability to synthesize influences from multiple traditions into distinctly Ottoman forms of artistic expression. The Süleymaniye Mosque complex in Istanbul, designed by the master architect Sinan, represented not merely a religious building, but a comprehensive social institution that included schools, hospitals, public kitchens, and facilities for travelers and the poor. The complex demonstrated how Ottoman architecture could combine spiritual grandeur with practical social service while creating urban landmarks that reinforced imperial identity and cultural values. Sinan's architectural innovations extended far beyond Istanbul to encompass building projects throughout the empire that adapted Ottoman design principles to local conditions and materials while maintaining overall stylistic coherence. The hundreds of mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings that were constructed during Suleiman's reign created an architectural legacy that influenced building design throughout the Islamic world, while demonstrating the empire's commitment to creating permanent institutions, rather than simply extracting wealth from conquered territories. The cultural synthesis that reached its peak during Suleiman's reign reflected the empire's success in creating a distinctive Ottoman identity that incorporated the best elements from Turkish, Persian, Arab, and Byzantine traditions, while remaining open to influences from European and other sources. The literature, music, and decorative arts that flourished during this period combined technical excellence with thematic content that celebrated Ottoman achievements while exploring universal human experiences of love, loss, spiritual aspiration, and moral responsibility. The court culture that developed around Suleiman himself became a model for royal behavior that influenced monarchical traditions throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The Sultan's combination of martial prowess, legal scholarship, artistic patronage, and personal piety created a template for ideal rulership that balanced the practical requirements of governing a world empire with the moral and cultural responsibilities that true leadership demanded. His court attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the known world, while maintaining standards of intellectual and artistic excellence that made Istanbul one of the great cultural centers of the age. The naval expansion that occurred during Suleiman's reign transformed the Ottoman Empire into a truly global maritime power, capable of challenging European dominance in waters from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The appointment of Hayreddin Barbarossa as admiral of the Ottoman fleet brought to imperial service one of the most capable naval commanders of the age, whose expertise in both traditional Mediterranean galley warfare and emerging oceanic sailing techniques enabled Ottoman naval power to reach unprecedented levels of effectiveness. The expansion of Ottoman naval capabilities required massive investments in shipbuilding facilities, naval bases, and the training of sailors and officers who could operate effectively in diverse maritime environments. The imperial arsenals that were established during this period produced warships that incorporated the latest developments in naval architecture, while adapting these innovations to Ottoman strategic needs and operational requirements. The resulting fleet could challenge Venetian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, while supporting Ottoman operations in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied Ottoman expansion under Suleiman reflected the empire's emergence as a major player in European politics, while maintaining its leadership position in the Islamic world. The alliance with France against their common Habsburg enemies created unprecedented cooperation between Christian and Muslim powers, while demonstrating that religious differences need not prevent strategic partnerships based on shared interests. This diplomatic innovation influenced international relations throughout Europe, while providing both empires with strategic advantages that neither could have achieved independently. The commercial policies that Suleiman implemented transformed Ottoman territories into some of the most prosperous regions in the world, while creating economic networks that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe in ways that had never before been possible. Imperial control over crucial trade routes enabled Ottoman merchants to participate in global commerce, while imperial policies that protected property rights and enforced commercial contracts created stable conditions for business development that attracted traders and craftsmen from throughout the known world. The religious policies that governed Ottoman treatment of diverse populations established precedents for religious tolerance that were unprecedented in their scope and systematic application. While the empire remained fundamentally Islamic in its legal and cultural identity, the practical accommodation of Christian, Jewish, and other religious communities created a model of pluralistic governance that enabled different faith traditions to coexist within a unified political framework. This achievement required constant negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed, but its success provided stability that supported economic prosperity and cultural achievement throughout the empire. The military innovations that emerged during Suleiman's reign reflected the empire's commitment to maintaining technological superiority while adapting to changing conditions of warfare. The integration of improved firearms, artillery, and fortification techniques into Ottoman military doctrine required systematic approaches to training, supply, and tactical coordination that kept Ottoman forces ahead of their competitors in both equipment and operational effectiveness. The military engineering projects that were undertaken during this period, including the construction of fortresses and the improvement of supply routes, created infrastructure that supported not only military operations, but also commercial and administrative activities throughout the empire. The scientific and intellectual achievements that flourished under Suleiman's patronage reflected the empire's recognition that military and political success required advancement in all fields of human knowledge. The observatories, libraries, and research institutions that were established during this period attracted scholars from across the known world, while fostering innovations that contributed to the broader development of human understanding in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other fields of inquiry. The educational reforms that Suleiman implemented created the most comprehensive system of public education that had ever been attempted by any government in human history. The network of schools that was established throughout Ottoman territories provided instruction not only in religious subjects, but also in mathematics, literature, history, and practical skills necessary for participation in commercial and administrative activities. This educational system created opportunities for social mobility that were unprecedented in their scope, while ensuring that the empire could draw upon the full range of human talent available within its borders. The legal scholarship that reached its peak during Suleiman's reign produced jurisprudential innovations that influenced legal development throughout the Islamic world, while creating precedents that would be studied and emulated by legal scholars for centuries. The systematic approach to legal codification that Ottoman jurists developed provided models for creating comprehensive legal systems that could accommodate diverse populations and changing circumstances, while maintaining overall coherence and legitimacy. The economic prosperity that characterized much of Suleiman's reign reflected successful imperial policies that encouraged productive activity while maintaining the security and stability necessary for long-term investment and development. The wealth that was generated by Ottoman commercial and agricultural activities supported not only military forces and administrative systems, but also the cultural and intellectual achievements that made this period one of the great golden ages in human history. The urban development that occurred throughout Ottoman territories during this period created cities that combined commercial prosperity with architectural grandeur and social services that provided for the needs of diverse populations. The planning and construction of these urban centers required sophisticated coordination of resources and expertise, while demonstrating the empire's commitment to creating permanent institutions that would benefit future generations as well as contemporary inhabitants. The technological innovations that emerged from Ottoman workshops and research institutions contributed to advancement in fields ranging from military engineering to textile production, while creating new opportunities for economic development and cultural expression. The systematic approach to technological development that characterized Ottoman institutions provided models for organizing research and development activities that would influence scientific and technical progress throughout the known world. As Suleiman's reign entered its final decades, the Ottoman Empire had achieved a level of power, prosperity, and cultural achievement that established it as one of the greatest civilizations in human history. The institutions and traditions that had been created during this golden age would continue to influence human development for centuries, while demonstrating the remarkable potential of human organization and achievement when guided by vision, wisdom, and commitment to excellence in all endeavors. The legacy of Suleiman's achievements extended far beyond the territories that acknowledged Ottoman authority to encompass contributions to law, architecture, literature, science, and governance that enriched human civilization as a whole. The empire that he had guided to its zenith represented not merely a successful conquest state, but a comprehensive approach to human organization that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility, religious diversity with political unity, and cultural achievement with practical effectiveness in ways that had never before been achieved on such a scale. The death of Suleiman in 1566 during the siege of Sigetvar marked the end of an era, but the institutions and cultural achievements that had flourished during his reign established foundations that would enable the Ottoman Empire to remain a major force in world affairs for centuries to come. The transformation of a small frontier principality into a world empire that controlled 3 continents while creating legal codes, architectural marvels, and intellectual achievements that influenced human development represented one of the most remarkable success stories in the long chronicle of human civilization and imperial achievement. The throne that passed to Selim II in 1566 carried the weight of expectations that no mortal ruler could reasonably fulfill. How do you follow a legend? How do you govern an empire that has reached the very pinnacle of human achievement under your predecessor? The new sultan faced challenges that went beyond the traditional concerns of warfare and administration to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of imperial success and the sustainability of institutions built around the exceptional capabilities of individual leaders. Selim II possessed neither the military genius of his father nor the burning ambition that had driven Ottoman expansion for nearly 3 centuries. History would remember him as Selim the Sot, a ruler more comfortable with the pleasures of palace life than the rigors of campaign warfare. Yet this characterization, while containing elements of truth, obscures the profound transformation that the Ottoman Empire underwent during his reign as it evolved from a conquest state dependent on continuous expansion into a mature imperial system focused on consolidation and internal development. The challenges that confronted the empire during the 1570s revealed how thoroughly the Ottoman system had become dependent on the personal leadership of exceptional sultans. The administrative machinery that functioned smoothly under Suleiman's direct oversight began to show signs of strain when required to operate without constant imperial attention and intervention. Provincial governors who had previously competed for royal favor through military achievement and administrative efficiency began to focus more on personal enrichment and the accumulation of local power bases that could function independently of central authority. The Janissary Corps, which had been the backbone of Ottoman military supremacy for over 2 centuries, began to exhibit troubling signs of institutional decay, as the empire's reduced emphasis on military expansion eliminated many of the opportunities for advancement and enrichment that had traditionally motivated these elite soldiers. Without regular campaigns to test their skills and provide advancement opportunities, the Janissaries increasingly involved themselves in commercial activities and political maneuvering that compromised their military effectiveness while creating new sources of instability within the imperial system. The naval disaster at Lepanto in 1571 shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility that had been carefully cultivated since the conquest of Constantinople over a century earlier. The Holy League's decisive victory demonstrated that Ottoman military superiority was not absolute, and that European powers, when properly coordinated and motivated, could challenge Ottoman dominance even in areas where the empire had long held unchallenged supremacy. The psychological impact of this defeat reverberated throughout the empire while encouraging resistance movements in territories that had previously accepted Ottoman rule as inevitable. Yet the Ottoman response to Lepanto revealed the institutional resilience that the empire had developed during its golden age. Rather than allowing the naval defeat to trigger broader imperial collapse, Ottoman administrators immediately began implementing reforms designed to address the weaknesses that the battle had revealed. New shipbuilding programs expanded the imperial fleet, while improved training procedures enhanced the effectiveness of Ottoman naval personnel. Within 2 years, the empire had reconstructed a Mediterranean fleet that was larger and more capable than the one that had been destroyed at Lepanto. The conquest of Cyprus during this same period demonstrated that Ottoman military capabilities remained formidable despite the setbacks that had occurred in other theatres. The systematic reduction of Venetian strongholds on the island showcased the continued effectiveness of Ottoman siege warfare, while providing the empire with strategic control over eastern Mediterranean trade routes. The integration of Cyprus into the Ottoman administrative system proceeded with the efficiency that had characterized previous territorial acquisitions, creating new sources of revenue while extending imperial authority into previously independent maritime territories. The administrative innovations that emerged during Selim's reign reflected the empire's gradual transition from expansion-focused institutions towards systems designed for long-term governance of stable territories. The development of more sophisticated fiscal systems enabled more efficient extraction of revenue from existing territories, while reducing the empire's dependence on the plunder and tribute that conquest had traditionally provided. These financial innovations created more predictable sources of imperial income, while enabling better planning for long-term projects and institutional development. The legal reforms that continued during this period built upon the foundations that Suleiman had established, while adapting Ottoman jurisprudence to address new challenges that arose from governing mature imperial territories. The standardization of legal procedures across diverse provinces created greater consistency in imperial governance, while the development of specialized commercial courts facilitated the increasingly complex trade relationships that connected Ottoman territories with global commercial networks. The cultural achievements that flourished during Selim's reign reflected the empire's growing sophistication and its ability to support artistic and intellectual endeavors through peaceful prosperity rather than military conquest. The architectural projects that were completed during this period, while perhaps less grandiose than those of the Suleiman era, demonstrated remarkable technical skill and aesthetic refinement while serving practical needs of growing urban populations throughout the empire. The emergence of new literary forms during this period revealed the creative vitality that could flourish when imperial culture was not primarily focused on military themes and conquest narratives. Ottoman poets and writers began exploring more diverse subjects while developing distinctly Ottoman approaches to universal human experiences that resonated across cultural and religious boundaries. This literary renaissance contributed to the development of a more sophisticated Ottoman cultural identity that could appeal to diverse populations while maintaining imperial unity. The diplomatic challenges that confronted the empire during the 1570s required new approaches to international relations as Ottoman expansion slowed and the empire found itself dealing with neighbors as equals rather than as potential conquest targets. The complex negotiations with Safavid Persia over territorial boundaries in the Caucasus and Mesopotamia demonstrated the empire's ability to resolve disputes through diplomatic means, while maintaining strategic advantages that had been gained through previous military campaigns. The commercial expansion that occurred during this period transformed Ottoman territories into some of the most prosperous regions in the world, as imperial control over trade routes enabled unprecedented levels of international commerce. The development of new commercial relationships with European powers created economic interdependencies that often proved more durable than military alliances, while providing the empire with access to new technologies and ideas that enhanced Ottoman capabilities in multiple fields. The religious developments that characterized this era reflected the empire's growing confidence in its Islamic identity, while maintaining the practical tolerance that had enabled successful governance of diverse populations. The construction of new mosques and religious institutions throughout Ottoman territories provided focal points for community identity, while the continued protection of Christian and Jewish communities demonstrated the empire's commitment to the pluralistic principles that had contributed to its success. The educational expansion that occurred during Selim's reign created new opportunities for intellectual development, while training the administrators and specialists necessary for governing an increasingly complex empire. The madrasas and other schools that were established during this period attracted students from across the Islamic world, while developing curricula that balanced religious instruction with practical training in law, administration, and commercial activities. The military reforms that were implemented following the Lepanto disaster revealed the empire's capacity for institutional adaptation and innovation even during periods of apparent decline. The development of new training methods, improved weapon systems, and enhanced coordination procedures created military forces that remained competitive with contemporary European armies, while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that had made Ottoman forces so effective throughout their history of expansion. The urban development that continued throughout Ottoman territories during this period created cities that combined commercial prosperity with architectural beauty and social services that provided for the needs of diverse populations. The planning and construction of these urban centers required sophisticated coordination of resources and expertise, while demonstrating the empire's commitment to creating permanent institutions that would benefit future generations. The technological innovations that emerged from Ottoman workshops during this period contributed to advancement in fields ranging from military engineering to textile production, while creating new opportunities for economic development. The systematic approach to technological development that characterized Ottoman institutions continued to provide models for organizing research and development activities that influenced progress throughout the known world. The agricultural improvements that were implemented during this period increased productivity throughout Ottoman territories while supporting larger populations and generating additional revenue for imperial activities. The development of new irrigation systems, improved crop varieties, and more efficient farming techniques demonstrated the empire's commitment to enhancing the welfare of its subjects while strengthening the economic foundations that supported imperial power. The legal scholarship that continued to flourish during this era produced jurisprudential innovations that influenced legal development throughout the Islamic world, while creating precedents that would be studied by legal scholars for centuries. The systematic approach to legal analysis and codification that Ottoman jurists had developed provided models for creating comprehensive legal systems that could accommodate diverse populations and changing circumstances. As Selim's reign progressed through the 1570s, the Ottoman Empire began to exhibit characteristics that would define its development for the next 2 centuries. The transformation from a conquest state to a mature imperial system created new opportunities for cultural and economic development, while also generating challenges that would test Ottoman institutional resilience in ways that military expansion had never done. The death of Selim II in 1574 marked the beginning of a new phase in Ottoman history, as the empire entered an era where success would be measured not by territorial expansion, but by the ability to maintain unity and prosperity across existing territories while adapting to changing international circumstances. The institutions and traditions that had been developed during the empire's first 3 centuries would now face the test of time as they dealt with challenges that required administrative skill and diplomatic finesse rather than military conquest. The succession of Murad III to the throne brought with it both continuity and change, as the new sultan inherited an empire that remained one of the world's most powerful states while facing pressures that would require new approaches to governance and international relations. The stage was set for a period of Ottoman history that would test every institution and tradition that the empire had developed, while revealing whether the remarkable achievements of the previous centuries had created foundations solid enough to support continued greatness, even as the circumstances that had originally enabled Ottoman success continued to evolve and change. The reign of Murad III, which began in 1574 and would extend into the final decades of the 16th century, coincided with a period of profound transformation throughout the world as European exploration opened new trade routes, religious conflicts reshaped political alliances, and technological innovations changed the nature of warfare and communication. The Ottoman Empire's response to these global changes would determine whether it could maintain its position as a world power or would begin the slow decline that would eventually reduce it to a regional authority struggling to maintain relevance in an increasingly interconnected world. The palace culture that flourished under Murad III reflected both the wealth that the empire had accumulated during its golden age and the growing isolation of imperial leadership from the practical challenges of governing diverse territories across 3 continents. The Topkapi Palace became an increasingly elaborate and ceremonial institution where protocol and tradition often took precedence over the practical decision-making that effective governance required. This development, while creating magnificent artistic and architectural achievements, also contributed to a growing disconnect between imperial authority and the real conditions that existed throughout Ottoman territories. The influence of the imperial harem reached unprecedented levels during Murad's reign, as the sultan's mother and wives became major players in political decision-making and administrative appointments. This development, known as the Sultanate of Women, created new power centers within the imperial system, while also generating conflicts and inefficiencies that complicated the implementation of coherent policies. The period revealed both the sophistication of Ottoman court culture and the potential dangers that could arise when political authority became divorced from military and administrative competence. The economic challenges that emerged during this period reflected global changes that were beyond Ottoman control, while also revealing weaknesses in imperial fiscal systems that had been masked by the wealth generated during previous centuries of expansion. The influx of New World silver into European markets created inflationary pressures that affected Ottoman territories, while the development of new trade routes around Africa reduced the importance of traditional overland routes that the empire controlled. These economic pressures required adjustments to imperial policy that tested the flexibility of Ottoman institutions and the competence of imperial administrators. The military innovations that European powers implemented during this period began to erode the technological advantages that had been crucial to Ottoman success for over 2 centuries. The development of improved firearms, artillery systems, and fortification techniques by European engineers created new challenges for Ottoman forces, while the empire's reduced emphasis on military innovation began to show in battlefield performance. The gradual shift in military balance would have profound implications for Ottoman strategic planning and international relations in the centuries that followed. The provincial rebellions that began to emerge during Murad's reign reflected growing tensions between central authority and local interests that had been developing as the empire matured from a conquest state into a bureaucratic system. The Salali revolts in Anatolia demonstrated that even core Ottoman territories were not immune to the centrifugal forces that could threaten imperial unity when central authority was perceived as weak or distant from local concerns. These internal conflicts required military resources and administrative attention that reduced the empire's capacity to respond to external challenges while revealing vulnerabilities in the imperial system that enemies could potentially exploit. The religious developments that occurred during this period reflected the empire's continued commitment to Islamic principles, while also revealing growing tensions between different interpretations of religious authority and imperial responsibility. The influence of various Sufi orders and religious scholars on imperial policy created new dynamics within Ottoman political culture. While the empire's relationships with other Islamic powers became increasingly complex, as religious and political considerations sometimes conflicted with practical strategic interests. The architectural achievements that continued during Murad's reign demonstrated the empire's ongoing cultural vitality, while also revealing the growing emphasis on ceremonial and aesthetic considerations rather than purely functional concerns. The mosque complexes and public buildings that were constructed during this period exhibited remarkable artistic sophistication, while serving practical needs of urban populations throughout the empire. These construction projects continued to employ thousands of craftsmen, while creating urban landmarks that reinforced Ottoman cultural identity. The diplomatic relationships that the empire maintained during this period became increasingly complex, as European powers developed new capabilities and ambitions that challenged traditional Ottoman assumptions about international relations. The empire's alliances and conflicts with various European states required more sophisticated diplomatic approaches, while the emergence of new global powers created strategic challenges that demanded careful analysis and response. The commercial activities that continued to flourish throughout Ottoman territories during this period demonstrated the empire's continued economic vitality, while also revealing growing competition from European merchants who were developing new trade routes and commercial techniques. The challenge of maintaining Ottoman commercial advantages while adapting to changing global economic conditions would require innovations in imperial policy and business practices that tested the flexibility of existing systems. The cultural synthesis that had characterized Ottoman achievement for centuries continued during this period as the empire's scholars, artists, and craftsmen incorporated new influences while maintaining distinctive Ottoman approaches to intellectual and artistic expression. The libraries, workshops, and educational institutions that flourished throughout Ottoman territories continued to attract talent from across the known world, while contributing to the broader development of human knowledge and cultural achievement. The legal developments that occurred during Murad's reign reflected the empire's ongoing commitment to maintaining sophisticated jurisprudential systems while adapting to changing social and economic conditions. The courts and legal scholars who administered Ottoman law continued to demonstrate remarkable skill in balancing religious requirements with practical needs, while maintaining the consistency and fairness that had contributed to imperial legitimacy and stability. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire remained one of the world's most powerful and sophisticated states, controlling territories that stretched across 3 continents while maintaining institutions that governed diverse populations with remarkable effectiveness. Yet, the challenges that had emerged during Murad's reign foreshadowed difficulties that would become increasingly prominent in the centuries that followed, as the empire struggled to adapt to a changing world, while maintaining the traditions and institutions that had enabled its remarkable rise to greatness. The transformation of the Ottoman Empire from a small frontier principality to a world power that controlled territories from Hungary to Yemen represented one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, demonstrating the potential of human organization, ambition, and cultural synthesis to create institutions that could endure across centuries while adapting to changing circumstances. The story of Ottoman success provided lessons about leadership, administration, military innovation, and cultural development that continued to influence human civilization long after the empire itself had passed into history. The empire that entered the 17th century bore little resemblance to the dynamic conquest state that had emerged from the hills of northwestern Anatolia 3 centuries earlier. Where once Ottoman armies had struck terror into the hearts of European monarchs and carved new provinces from enemy territory with clockwork regularity, the empire now found itself increasingly on the defensive, struggling to maintain boundaries that had once seemed destined for endless expansion. The transformation was subtle at first, masked by the enormous wealth and administrative sophistication that centuries of success had accumulated. But the underlying dynamics of Ottoman power were shifting in ways that would reshape the empire's relationship with the world. The reign of Mehmed II, which began in 1603, coincided with a period when European military technology was advancing faster than Ottoman innovations could match. The disciplined pike squares and improved artillery that European armies had developed created tactical challenges that traditional Ottoman cavalry and Janissary formations found increasingly difficult to overcome. The long Turkish war with Austria, which dragged on for 13 years and ended in 1606 with the Treaty of Zitvatarok, marked the first time that the Ottoman Empire had signed a peace agreement with a European power as an equal rather than from a position of overwhelming superiority. The treaty's terms, which required the Ottomans to cease demanding annual tribute from Austria while acknowledging the Habsburg Emperor's equality with the Ottoman Sultan, represented a diplomatic revolution that shocked contemporary observers throughout Europe and the Islamic world. For over 2 centuries, Ottoman diplomatic practice had been based on the assumption of imperial superiority, with other powers seeking Ottoman favor rather than negotiating as equals. The new reality of diplomatic parity reflected underlying shifts in the balance of power that would continue to evolve throughout the 17th century. The economic pressures that had begun to emerge during the late 16th century intensified during the early decades of the 17th century as global trade patterns continued to shift away from the overland routes that the Ottoman Empire controlled. The Dutch and English East India Companies had established direct maritime connections between Europe and Asia that bypassed Ottoman territories entirely, reducing the customs revenues and commercial profits that had supported imperial expansion for generations. The empire's inability to develop competitive naval capabilities for oceanic warfare meant that these new trade routes remained beyond Ottoman influence or control. The debasement of Ottoman currency that began during this period reflected the fiscal pressures created by reduced revenues and continued military expenses. The silver content of Ottoman coins was gradually reduced while their nominal values remained constant, creating inflationary pressures that affected all levels of society. Soldiers complained that their traditional salaries could no longer support their families, while merchants found that price instability complicated long-term planning and international transactions. The Janissary Corps, which had been the backbone of Ottoman military supremacy for over 3 centuries, began to exhibit signs of institutional decay that would eventually threaten the empire's internal stability. The elite soldiers who had once been recruited exclusively through the Devshirme system from Christian populations increasingly came from Turkish Muslim families who purchased positions for their sons. This transformation eliminated the personal loyalty to the sultan that had made the Janissaries so effective, while introducing hereditary interests that conflicted with imperial service. The involvement of Janissary units in commercial activities throughout Ottoman territories created new problems for imperial administration, as these soldiers used their privileged status to avoid taxes and regulations that applied to ordinary merchants. Their monopolization of certain trades generated resentment among civilian populations, while their political influence in Istanbul enabled them to resist reforms that might have improved their military effectiveness. The corps that had once been the empire's greatest strength was becoming a source of instability and inefficiency. The provincial administration that had functioned effectively during the empire's expansion phase began to show signs of strain as reduced central revenues limited the resources available for maintaining order and collecting taxes in distant territories. Local officials who had previously competed for imperial favor through efficient administration increasingly focused on personal enrichment, creating corruption networks that diverted resources from imperial coffers, while reducing the quality of governance that ordinary subjects experienced. The emergence of regional strongmen who could challenge central authority represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the imperial center and provincial territories. In areas where central control was weak, ambitious individuals could accumulate private armies and establish semi-independent domains that acknowledged Ottoman sovereignty in name while operating according to their own interests. These developments foreshadowed the decentralization that would characterize much of Ottoman history during the 18th and 19th centuries. The cultural achievements that continued during this period demonstrated the empire's enduring sophistication and creativity despite the political and military challenges it faced. The architectural projects undertaken during Ahmed I's reign, including the magnificent Blue Mosque in Istanbul, rivaled the greatest achievements of the classical period while adapting traditional Ottoman design principles to contemporary aesthetic preferences. The mosque's 6 minarets and elaborate tile work created a masterpiece that enhanced Istanbul's skyline while serving the spiritual needs of the city's growing population. The literary and artistic developments that flourished during the early 17th century reflected the empire's continued ability to synthesize influences from multiple traditions while maintaining distinctive Ottoman characteristics. The poets and writers of this era produced works that explored both traditional Islamic themes and more secular subjects that reflected the empire's cosmopolitan character. The decorative arts that emerged from imperial workshops continued to set standards for quality and innovation that influenced artistic development throughout Europe and Asia. The scientific and intellectual activities that continued throughout Ottoman territories during this period demonstrated the empire's commitment to learning and innovation, despite the challenges posed by changing global circumstances. The observatories and libraries that had been established during earlier periods continued to attract scholars, while producing research that contributed to the broader advancement of human knowledge. The medical schools and hospitals that operated throughout the empire maintained standards of care that were among the most advanced in the world. The religious institutions that served Ottoman populations continued to provide social services and educational opportunities that enhanced the quality of life for millions of subjects, while reinforcing the Islamic identity that remained central to imperial legitimacy. The mosque complexes that functioned throughout Ottoman territories combined spiritual guidance with practical assistance, providing food for the poor, education for children, and medical care for the sick. These institutions created social networks that bound communities together while connecting local populations to the broader imperial system. The diplomatic innovations that Ottoman leaders implemented during this period reflected growing recognition that the empire's international relationships required more sophisticated approaches than the simple assertion of superiority that had characterized earlier periods. The development of permanent diplomatic missions and the employment of skilled negotiators who could navigate complex European political situations enabled the empire to maintain strategic advantages through diplomacy when military solutions were not feasible or desirable. The military reforms that were attempted during various periods of the 17th century revealed both the empire's awareness of its changing strategic situation and the institutional obstacles that prevented effective modernization. The introduction of new weapons systems and tactical formations required training and organizational changes that conflicted with established interests and traditional practices. The resistance that reform efforts encountered from within the military establishment demonstrated how difficult it was to change institutions that had been successful for centuries, even when changing circumstances demanded adaptation. The commercial policies that the empire implemented during this period attempted to maintain Ottoman advantages in international trade while adapting to new competitive pressures from European merchants and trading companies. The development of new commercial agreements and the adjustment of customs regulations reflected efforts to preserve Ottoman commercial interests while acknowledging the reality of increased competition in global markets. The urban development that continued throughout Ottoman territories during the 17th century created cities that combined traditional Islamic architectural principles with practical adaptations to local conditions and changing social needs. The planning and construction of these urban centers required coordination of resources and expertise, while demonstrating the empire's continued commitment to creating environments that could support diverse populations and economic activities. The educational institutions that operated throughout the empire during this period continued to provide instruction in both traditional Islamic subjects and practical skills necessary for participation in commercial and administrative activities. The madrasas and other schools that functioned in major cities throughout Ottoman territories attracted students from across the Islamic world, while maintaining standards of scholarship that contributed to intellectual development throughout the region. The legal system that continued to operate throughout Ottoman territories during the 17th century maintained the sophisticated balance between religious law and practical administration that had characterized Ottoman jurisprudence since Suleiman's time. The courts that administered justice throughout the empire continued to handle complex cases involving commercial disputes, property rights, and family law, while maintaining consistency with Islamic principles and imperial policies. As the 17th century progressed toward its midpoint, the Ottoman Empire remained a formidable power capable of fielding large armies, governing diverse populations across vast territories, and maintaining cultural institutions that rivaled those of any contemporary state. Yet the challenges that had emerged during the early decades of the century continued to intensify, creating pressures that would test Ottoman institutional resilience in ways that the empire's founders could never have anticipated. The transformation from expansion to consolidation that characterized this period represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Ottoman power and the challenges that imperial leadership faced. The skills and institutions that had enabled remarkable territorial conquest and cultural achievement during the empire's first 3 centuries required adaptation to circumstances that emphasized defensive warfare, diplomatic negotiation, and internal administration, rather than offensive operations and territorial expansion. The story of the Ottoman Empire during the 17th century thus became one of adaptation and resistance to change. As an institution that had achieved greatness through flexibility and innovation, struggled to maintain its position in a world that was evolving faster than traditional responses could address. The empire's ultimate fate would depend on its ability to preserve the essential characteristics that had enabled its rise while adapting to new realities that demanded different approaches to governance, warfare, and international relations. The legacy of Ottoman achievement during these crucial decades would influence not only the empire's subsequent development, but also the broader patterns of political, cultural, and economic change that shape the modern world. The institutions, traditions, and cultural achievements that had been created during the empire's golden age would continue to influence human civilization long after the political entity that had created them had passed into history, demonstrating the enduring power of human creativity and organizational genius to transcend the particular circumstances that had originally given them birth. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the corridors of this magnificent palace of time, where sultans once walked and Janissaries stood guard, where scholars debated the mysteries of the universe and craftsmen created objects of breathtaking beauty. The Ottoman Empire, which began as a dream in the mind of a tribal chieftain named Osman, grew into one of history's most remarkable civilizations before gradually fading into the pages of memory. Its story reminds us that all human achievements, no matter how grand, are temporary, but the ideas, innovations, and cultural contributions they create can echo through eternity, continuing to inspire and inform long after the last sultan has departed and the final crescent flag has been lowered. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with the echoes of this extraordinary journey through 6 centuries of human ambition, creativity, and the endless quest for greatness that defines our shared human story.